So now we are approaching our departure runway. Once we get to the runway, we're going to hold short, and then I'm going to explain to you the takeoff procedure. So now we're holding short at runway 28 right. One thing we're going to have to do is activate the LNAV mode on the autopilot, which is stands for lateral navigation. What this will do is it'll get information from the flight management computer from our flight plan. For each waypoint on the flight plan, the FMC is calculated in a target altitude and a target speed it needs to be at upon reaching that waypoint, and then this information is then fed to the autopilot, which when enabled, it will fly the airplane to those waypoints at those altitudes and those speeds. And if the autopilot's not on, then all the pilot needs to do is just follow the flight director. So the LNAV, it'll take care of the lateral component of it, which will make sure it follows this curve over here. VNAV will ensure that the plane will meet those altitude and speed targets. But we're not going to enable that just yet. Once we're on the runway, we're going to advance the throttles to about 50%, and then we're going to activate a EPR, which stands for engine pressure ratio. This will advance the throttles to their takeoff setting, and then once we're in the air and raise the landing gear, we're going to switch to VNAV mode, and that'll provide guidance for the airplane according to the flight plan. So now that we're ready for takeoff, we're going to taxi onto the runway. Just going to check my checklists, make sure aircraft is properly configured for takeoff. So here we are on our departure runway, 28 right. We're going to brake over here. We have to turn on the landing lights and turn off the taxi lights. The landing lights are powerful lights in the leading edges of each wing, and on the landing gear they illuminate the ground a little more. It allows other pilots to see the plane and the pilots to see the ground a little better. Okay, it looks like we're properly configured for takeoff, so we're going to advance the throttles to about 50%. Let's start our timer, activate EPR. Now they're at the takeoff setting.
80 knots.
A little bit of crosswind.
V1. Rotate.
Gonna pull up the nose of the aircraft.
Caution, terrain.
Positive rate of climb. Gear up.
Caution, terrain. Caution, terrain. Caution, terrain.
We're gonna begin our turn over here. Activate VNAV. That'll reduce the thrust for us a little bit. what I'm doing is I'm just following the flight director bars, and that'll make sure the aircraft stays on its flight plan, its flight path. We're following this curve, magenta curve, on the navigation display. We can go ahead and raise our flaps, since we don't need them anymore. Okay. Right now I'll activate the autopilot by hitting this switch. Now I don't need to manually fly the aircraft anymore, the autopilot will just fly it for us. The way an autopilot works is it doesn't work completely independently from the pilots. The pilots need to give it instructions to do something, and they can always override it. So if we don't want to follow this whole curve over here, wait a minute. So if you look out the window, you can see the Golden Gate Bridge over there. So we're not gonna go all the way this waypoint. In real life, the air traffic control will tell you to probably go direct to Syra. So what you do is you do this, hit execute, then that'll redirect the aircraft to that waypoint. What we need to do is put our landing gear lever in the neutral position. What this does is it depressurizes the hydraulic system that is used to operate the landing gear, and we do this because we don't want any leaks to occur. So now I'm not doing any manual flying. The autopilot is doing all the flying for us. It's flying the aircraft according to the flight plan. We've already passed 10,000 feet. When you pass 10,000 feet, you can turn off the landing lights, since you don't need them anymore. Everything else looks good. If we zoom out a little, you'll see this point over here with the T/C that stands for top of climb. That is the point at which the aircraft will reach its cruising altitude. It's calculated by the flight management computer. So if we go over here, so right now we are 74 nautical miles from our top of climb. So in aviation, we don't use miles per hour or kilometers per hour. We use knots instead. That's a little bit of a different unit. So 1 knot means the plane will be moving at 1 nautical mile per hour. So right now we're going at 292 nautical miles per hour. And since we're above 10,000 feet, we're going above our speed of 250 knots. And the 757 has very powerful engines for an aircraft of its size, so it climbs out very rapidly. That's California. So right now there isn't very much for us to do except wait for the aircraft to reach its cruising altitude. One thing we'll have to do is when we reach 18,000 feet, we'll have to set our altimeter to the standard pressure, which is 1013 hectopascals, or to 9.92 inches of mercury. So there we are. I'm gonna leave it here and pick the video back up when we get closer to our cruising altitude. So while the aircraft is climbing out, I'll give you a little bit of a tour of the virtual cabin. So if we leave the flight deck and go into the cabin, this is the forward galley. It's the forward exit. This is the business class cabin, and behind it the economy cabin. As you can see, it's all modeled very nicely. Captain Sim did a really nice job. So if you move closer to the windows, you can kind of get an engine view. It's one of my favorite views on an aircraft. You can see the winglet. There are video screens that show the safety instructions. Now let's go back to the flight deck, since we're approaching our cruising altitude. So right now we're 1,000 feet away from our cruising altitude. We're going to start leveling off. As you can see, the vertical speed is going to begin to decrease as we level off to our cruise altitude. So these green letters over here, they display which flight modes are active right now. Right now speed is being controlled by the auto throttle. LNAV and VNAV are activated, and this, I believe, indicates that the autopilot is active. Another thing over here is speeds are also displayed in terms of Mach numbers. Right now we're flying at Mach 0.8, which means 80% of the speed of sound. That's very typical for an aircraft of this size. Some bigger aircraft like the 777 and 747 cruise at slightly higher Mach numbers. They can go up to Mach 0.85. This over here indicates the wind direction and the wind speed. Right now we have about 62 knots of tailwind. If we go over here, these switches control which data is displayed on the navigation display. So if we display route data, this shows the waypoint name, the target altitude, and the time and GMT at which the flight management computer expects us to be at that waypoint. So it took us 14 minutes to go from takeoff to our cruising altitude, as you can see. Here's the exterior of the aircraft.